Imagine leaving everything you have ever known. Your home, your family, your future. All of it is set aside for a destination you have never seen in a world almost entirely without maps. What kind of faith, or what kind of desperation, would it take to make that choice? The air in Clermont, France, is thick with anticipation in the autumn of the year 1095. A crisp November wind rustles the last of the dying leaves, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Thousands have gathered in an open field, a vast sea of faces turned towards a single raised platform. They are nobles in their finer wools, clergy in their dark robes, and common folk in rough-spun tunics, all straining to hear the words of one man, Pope Urban II. As his voice rises, so does the destiny of a generation. It's a moment that will echo for centuries, and we're going to experience it together. As our story begins, I'm always fascinated to know where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is for you. It's amazing to think of us all connected by this single moment in history. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe. Here, we believe that history is not just a collection of dates and facts, but a tapestry of human stories. And we find that these stories, when told calmly, can help us unwind, relax, and gently fall asleep. Tonight, in Bedtime History, we journey back to a time of profound faith and brutal conflict, from the thunderous response to the popes called the cries of Deus Vult. We will follow the very first waves of people who took up the cross. They were not all soldiers. In fact, the first to move were a tide of ordinary men and women, swept up in a fervor that would change the world. To understand the fire that was lit on that November day, we must first understand the world that was ready to burn. The 11th century was an age of contradictions. It was an era of deep, abiding Christian faith, yet it was also a time of relentless, localized violence. Across Europe, and especially in France, a warrior class of knights, with little to do but fight, preyed upon each other and upon the peasantry. The Church had tried for decades to contain this violence through movements known as the Peace of God and the Truce of God, which sought to forbid fighting on certain days and to protect non-combatants. But these efforts were only partially successful. The aggression of the European nobility was a force of nature, a coiled spring of martial energy looking for a release. Meanwhile, far to the east, the great Byzantine Empire, the inheritor of Rome, was in peril. For centuries, it had stood as a Christian bastion against the powers of the East. But a new force had arisen from the steppes of Central Asia, the Seljuk Turks. They were fierce warriors, recent converts to Islam, and they had carved out a vast empire. In the year 1071, at a place called Manzikert, the Seljuks delivered a catastrophic defeat to the Byzantine army. It was a wound from which the empire had never truly recovered. In the decades that followed, the Seljuks overran almost all of Anatolia, the heartland of the Byzantine Empire, a land now known as modern-day Turkey. The emperor in Constantinople, Alexios I Komnenos, watched as his borders crumbled. He was a shrewd and capable ruler, but he was desperately short of skilled fighting men. And so, he sent a plea to the West. He wrote to the Pope in Rome, asking for help. He likely imagined a contingent of elite, well-trained mercenaries, a manageable force he could hire to help him push back the Turks from his lands. What he would get was something far beyond his wildest imagination. The Pope who received this plea was Urban II, born Odo of Chatillon. He was a French nobleman himself, a man who understood the psyche of the knights he was about to address. He was a shrewd political operator, deeply embroiled in a power struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor, known as the investiture controversy, asserting papal authority and proving that the Pope could command the armies of Christendom was a powerful motivation. He saw in Alexius's plea a golden opportunity, a chance to heal the growing rift between the Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic churches, a chance to assert his own power, and, most importantly, a chance to redirect the destructive violence of Europe's knights outward toward a common enemy. The Council of Clermont had been underway for more than a week, dealing with matters of church reform, but on its final day, Tuesday, the 27th of November, Pope Urban announced he would make a special address. The cathedral was far too small to hold the enormous crowd that had gathered. Nobles and commoners alike, drawn by the rumor of a momentous announcement. So they assembled in a field just outside the city walls. Picture the scene. The low autumn sun hangs in a gray sky. The breath of thousands of people mists in the crisp air. You can see the glint of steel from a knight's scabbard tucked beneath a heavy cloak. You can feel the texture of rough-spun wool against your skin. The crowd falls into a rapt silence as Pope Urban begins to speak. We do not have his exact words. No one wrote them down at the time. What we have are several later accounts written by men who were there, like Fulcher of Chartres and Robert the Monk. While they differ in their details, they agree on the core of his powerful message. He spoke of the suffering of their fellow Christians in the East. He painted a vivid, horrifying picture of the desecration of holy places and the persecution of pilgrims trying to reach Jerusalem. He called upon the knights of France, a race beloved by God, to turn their swords away from each other and toward the enemies of Christ. He framed the entire endeavor not as a war of conquest, but as an armed pilgrimage, a holy mission to liberate the Eastern Christians and to reclaim the city of Jerusalem, the very ground where Christ had walked. And then he made an offer of staggering significance. To any who took up this cause, who sewed a cross upon their tunic and marched east, he offered a plenary indulgence. This was a concept both new and profoundly powerful. It was the full remission of all temporal punishment for sin. In an age when people lived in constant fear of damnation and the pains of purgatory, this was an almost unbelievable promise, a spiritual clean slate, a direct ticket to heaven should they fall in the quest. It was a promise of salvation, not just for the pious, but for the violent. The very sins of a knight's life, the bloodshed and the pride, could be washed away by one final, holy act of violence. As his speech reached its crescendo, a fire caught in the hearts of the crowd. The pent-up frustrations, the religious piety, the knightly ambition, all fused into a single, explosive emotion. A cry went up, first from one section, then another, until it became a unified, deafening roar that shook the very fields of Clermont, Deus Vult. They shouted, again and again, God wills it. The phrase became a rallying cry, a simple and absolute justification for the monumental task ahead. In that moment, the First Crusade was born. The Pope, seeing the raw power he had unleashed, acted quickly. He appointed Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, a respected and pious man, as his official representative, the spiritual leader of the expedition. Crosses were cut from cloth and distributed, sewn onto the shoulders of men who had, in an instant, pledged their lives to a journey into the unknown. The Pope's words were like a spark on dry tinder. But before the great princes could even begin to organize their armies, the fire caught first among the common people, fanned by a charismatic and unlikely leader. The news from Clermont spread across Europe like wildfire. Preachers traveled from town to town, carrying their own embellished versions of Urban's speech, igniting a frenzy of religious excitement among the populace. The Pope had intended for the crusade to be a military expedition led by trained and disciplined nobles, set to depart in the summer of 1096. But the message resonated most deeply, not with the powerful, but with the poor. For them, life was a daily struggle, a grim cycle of toil and suffering. The promise of salvation, of a holy pilgrimage to the land of milk and honey, was an intoxicating escape. The most effective of these wandering preachers was a man from Amiens, known to history as Peter the Hermit. He was a small, thin man with a wild, piercing gaze. He rode a donkey and dressed in simple woolen clothes, but when he spoke, he held crowds spellbound. He claimed to carry a letter sent down from heaven itself, and people believed him. They flocked to him in the thousands, abandoning their fields and their homes to follow this strange prophet. He was not alone. Another leader emerged, a minor knight named Walter Sans of War, a name that fittingly translates to Walter the Penniless. Together, they gathered a vast, chaotic, and utterly unprepared host. This was not an army. It was a mass migration, a river of humanity that began to flow eastward in the spring of 1096, months before the official crusade was set to begin. They were a cross-section of medieval society's lower rungs. There were peasants who brought their entire families, believing they were marching to a new, holier life. There were lesser knights who could not afford to join the retinues of the great lords. There were women, children, and the elderly, all swept up in the same wave of fervent belief. Their banners were simple things, crosses hand-painted onto rough cloth. The sound of their journey was not the tramp of marching boots, but the shuffle of thousands of poorly shod feet on dusty roads, accompanied by the murmur of constant prayer. Their encampments at night were sprawling, chaotic cities of makeshift tents, smelling of unwashed bodies and the smoke of 1,000 small cooking fires. Their faith was pure, and their intentions, in their own minds, were righteous. But their zeal was untempered by discipline, and their journey quickly descended into darkness. As they marched through the Rhine Valley in Germany, their religious fervor curdled into a vicious, violent anti-Semitism. They saw the Jewish communities of cities like Speyer, Worms, and Mainz as enemies of Christ within their very midst. Why, they reasoned, should they march thousands of miles to fight infidels abroad, when there were those they considered Christ-killers at home? A terrible wave of violence was unleashed. Thousands of Jewish men, women, and children were massacred, given the brutal choice of conversion or death. It was a horrific stain on the very idea of the crusade, a prelude to the violence that would follow. Having left a trail of blood in the Rhineland, the mob pressed on. They had left with few provisions, believing that God would provide. But God did not, and hunger soon began to gnaw at their stomachs. As they crossed into Hungary and the Balkans, they became a desperate, ravenous swarm. They foraged, they stole, and they clashed violently with the local populations, who saw them not as holy pilgrims, but as a dangerous plague of locusts. Many were killed in these skirmishes. Still, the bulk of the horde, ragged and starving, but driven by Peter's charismatic preaching, finally reached the gates of Constantinople. Emperor Alexios was appalled. He had been expecting disciplined knights, elite soldiers, to fill his ranks. Instead, he was faced with this unruly, untrained, and unpredictable mob. They were a drain on his resources and a threat to the stability of his capital. His primary goal was to get them out of his city as quickly and as quietly as possible. With a mixture of promises and veiled threats, he persuaded them to wait for the main armies. But they were restless. After some of their number went on a pillaging spree in the suburbs, Alexios decided he had seen enough. He had them ferried across the Bosporus, the narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia. He was washing his hands of them. Now in Anatolia, in hostile territory, they set up a camp at a place called Civitate. Peter the Hermit urged caution, advising them to wait for the Byzantine escort and the arrival of the princes. He traveled back to Constantinople to plead for more supplies, but in his absence, the mob grew arrogant. They began raiding the surrounding countryside, sacking villages, and even attacking the nearby city of Nicaea. Their initial successes made them reckless. Ignoring the warnings of their more sensible leaders, a huge portion of the force, perhaps 20,000 strong, marched deep into Seljuk territory. They were marching straight into a trap. The Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan I, had been watching them. He knew they were not a real army. He allowed them to advance, drawing them further and further away from their camp. Then, just a few miles from Nicaea, he sprung his ambush. The attack was sudden and overwhelming. The Crusaders were caught completely by surprise on an open plain, the air filled with the terrifying whistle of countless arrows. The Seljuk cavalry, swift and deadly, descended upon them, shouting in a language they could not understand. The battle was a massacre. The People's Crusade, the crusade of pure faith, was annihilated. Almost everyone who had marched out from Civitate that day was killed or captured. The tragic end of the People's Crusade served as a grim warning. The Holy Land could not be won by faith alone. As news of their fate filtered back, the true military might of Europe was finally on the move. The great lords and their armies of professional soldiers. As the last echoes of the People's Crusade faded into tragedy, a different kind of host was assembling across Europe. This was the force Pope Urban had envisioned. It was not one army, but for great ones, each commanded by a powerful prince of Christendom, each with its own character, ambitions, and rivalries. They began their march in the late summer of 1096, their preparations a world away from the chaotic spontaneity of Peter the Hermit's followers. From the lands of Lorraine came the army of Godfrey of Bouillon. Godfrey was the Duke of Lower Lorraine, a pious and respected warrior who embodied the chivalric ideal. He was quiet, devout, and a formidable commander. With him were his two brothers, Eustace, a more worldly count, and Baldwin of Boulogne, a shrewd, ambitious, and landless knight. Their army was composed mostly of French and German-speaking knights, a disciplined and formidable force. From the south of Italy marched the Normans, led by the most feared and brilliant military commander of them all, Bohemond of Taranto, son of the infamous Robert Guiscard, who had spent his life fighting the Byzantine Empire. Bohemond was a giant of a man, cunning, ruthless, and filled with a boundless ambition. He saw the crusade not just as a holy war, but as an opportunity to carve out a kingdom for himself in the East. His piety was questionable, but his military genius was not. At his side was his nephew Tancred, a young knight who, like Godfrey, seemed to represent the purer, chivalrous ideal of the crusade. The largest and wealthiest contingent came from the south of France, led by the old and powerful Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse. Raymond was in his 60s, vastly experienced, and immensely rich. He was a veteran of the wars against the Muslims in Spain, and saw himself as the natural, secular leader of the entire expedition. a partner to the papal legate, Bishop Adhemar, who traveled with his army. He had sworn an oath to never return to his homeland, intending to live out his days in the East. The fourth major contingent was led by a collection of northern French nobles. There was Hugh, the Count of Vermandois, brother of the King of France, a man whose high birth was matched by his vanity. There was Robert Curthose, the Duke of Normandy, an eldest son of William the Conqueror, a brave but feckless leader. And with them was Stephen, the Count of Blois, a wealthy and influential lord who is remembered today mostly for the stream of letters he sent home to his wife Adela, providing us with a priceless, personal account of the journey. To assemble these armies was a logistical challenge of immense proportions. This was not a state-sponsored enterprise. Each lord had to fund his own expedition. They sold vast tracts of land. They mortgaged castles and entire domains to monasteries and churches. The preparations took months. All across Western Europe, the sound of blacksmiths' hammers rang out day and night, forging swords, hammering out helmets, and shoeing thousands upon thousands of war horses. The smell of polished leather, horse sweat, and cooling steel filled the air of every castle courtyard. Knights were fitted for their chainmail hauberks, feeling the immense, familiar weight settle onto their shoulders. Banners, brilliant with the colors and symbols of each noble house, were sewn and raised above a sea of tents. In cold stone cathedrals, solemn masses were held, as knights and their families prayed for a safe return they knew might never come. The camps were a cacophony of different languages and customs. French, Norman French, German, the Provençal dialect of Raymond's men, and the Italian of Bohemians, Normans, all mingled in the air, creating a constant source of confusion and misunderstanding. These were not unified forces. They were separate entities, bound only by a common oath and a common, distant goal. Their leaders were rivals as much as they were allies, each jealous of his own prestige and power. With their lands mortgaged and their affairs in order, the great armies of Christendom began their long march. Their first destination was the glittering capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, Constantinople, a city of wonders and the gateway to the hostile lands of the East. The journey to Constantinople was an epic undertaking in itself, a crusade before the crusade. Each of the four main armies took a different path, and each faced its own unique set of trials. The roads of 11th century Europe were not the paved highways of the Roman era, but often little more than muddy tracks, subject to the whims of the weather. Moving tens of thousands of soldiers, along with horses, pack animals, blacksmiths, priests, and a host of other non-combatant followers, was a logistical nightmare. Godfrey of Bouillon and his Lorrainers took the land route through Hungary, the same path where the People's Crusade had met with such hostility, but where Peter the Hermit's mob had pillaged. Godfrey's disciplined army negotiated. He met with the King of Hungary, leaving his own brother Baldwin as a hostage to guarantee his army's good conduct. As a result, his passage was peaceful. He was able to buy supplies and cross the country without incident, a testament to the importance of leadership and discipline. Raymond of Toulouse chose a more difficult route. He led his massive army from southern France down the coast of the Adriatic Sea, through the rugged and wild territory of Dalmatia. It was a hostile land, and his army was constantly harassed by locals. The journey was slow and punishing. The autumn rains turned the roads into a sucking mud that clung to the boots of the men and the hooves of the horses. Winter began to set in while they were still in the brutal mountains of the Balkans, and they suffered greatly from cold and starvation. Bohemond and his Normans from southern Italy took the most direct and politically charged route. They crossed the Adriatic Sea from Italy to modern-day Albania, landing in lands that the Byzantine Empire considered its own. This was the very same path Bohemon's father, Robert Guiscard, had used years earlier when he had invaded and attempted to conquer Byzantine territory. This history was not lost on Emperor Alexios. He knew Bohemon's reputation. He knew the ambition of the Normans. Of all the Crusader leaders marching toward his capital, it was Bohemond whom he trusted the least and feared the most. The journey took months for every contingent. The sheer struggle for daily sustenance was a constant concern. Unlike the People's Crusade, these armies were better organized, setting up carefully managed markets where they could, and sending out disciplined foraging parties when they could not. But still, they were a massive drain on the lands they passed through. They arrived at Constantinople, not all at once, but in staggered waves, beginning in the late autumn of 1096 and continuing through the spring of 1097. Hugh of Vermandois, the first to depart, had his fleet scattered by a storm, and he arrived not as a proud prince, but as a shipwrecked guest of the emperor. One by one, the other armies appeared on the horizon. For the Crusaders, their first glimpse of Constantinople was a moment of profound awe. As they crested the final hill, they saw it, a city of almost mythical proportions, defended by the most formidable fortifications in the world. The massive Theodosian walls. Inside those walls was a metropolis unlike anything they had ever known. The towns of Western Europe were, for the most part, small, cramped, and built of wood and stone. Constantinople was a sprawling city of 500,000 people, filled with marble palaces, gilded domes, and churches of breathtaking beauty. Like the Hagia Sophia, the markets overflowed with silks, spices, and goods from all corners of the known world. The air smelled of the sea, mixed with incense, and the unfamiliar scent of a great, thriving metropolis. The sound of Greek being spoken was a strange and alien tongue to their ears. It was a city that radiated wealth, sophistication, and power. They were simultaneously impressed and deeply envious. For Emperor Alexios, the sight of the armies gathering outside his walls was a cause for grave concern. The force assembled was far, far larger than anything he had anticipated or asked for. He had wanted a corps of elite mercenaries to help him reclaim his lands. He now had a semi-uncontrollable international army camped on his doorstep, led by powerful and ambitious men, one of whom was a traditional enemy of his empire. The first seeds of mistrust between the Westerners, whom the Byzantines called Latins, and the Eastern Romans, whom the Crusaders called Greeks, were sown in these early encounters. A cultural chasm separated them, a gap in understanding, language, and custom that would only grow wider. As the last of the great armies arrived, the fields outside Constantinople were transformed into a sprawling Latin city. But before they could be unleashed on the enemies of the cross, they had to contend with their powerful, wary, and deeply suspicious host, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos. The Crusaders were driven by faith, but also by ambition and the promise of land. As you listen, which motivation do you think was the strongest for most of them? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The great armies of the First Crusade were now gathered on the Asian shore of the Bosporus. Behind them, the glittering skyline of Constantinople, a city of wonders, was the last bastion of a world they understood. Ahead of them lay Anatolia, a vast, unknown, and hostile land. They were a formidable force, tens of thousands strong, united by an oath to reclaim the Holy Land. But before they could face the armies of the Seljuk Turks, they had first to navigate the complex and treacherous political currents of their uneasy alliance with the Byzantine emperor, a man who saw them as both a salvation and a potential catastrophe. The man who held the fate of the crusade in his hands was Emperor Alexios, the first Komnenos. He was no fool. He was a brilliant, shrewd, and deeply experienced ruler who had inherited an empire on the brink of collapse, and through sheer cunning and relentless effort had pulled it back from the abyss. He understood power, and he understood the hearts of ambitious men. When he saw the sheer scale of the armies arriving at his gates, he knew his initial request for a few hundred elite mercenaries had been dangerously misunderstood. This was not a relief force. This was a migration of warriors, a potential tidal wave that could just as easily smash his own empire as it could the Turks. His primary goal, therefore, was not to aid their quest, but to control it, to harness its power for the good of Byzantium, and to ensure it did not turn on him. To do this, he employed a classic strategy of divide and conquer. He refused to meet with the Crusader princes as a group. Instead, he summoned them one by one to the magnificent Blascherny Palace. Imagine the scene. A Western lord, a man like Godfrey or Bohemond, accustomed to the drafty, stone and timber halls of Europe, is ushered into the imperial throne room. The air is heavy with the sweet, exotic scent of incense and beeswax candles. The room is a masterpiece of gold, mosaic, and shimmering silk, opulent beyond their wildest dreams. The emperor sits on a raised throne, clad in robes of deep purple silk, intricately woven with gold thread. He is the image of absolute power and ancient authority, a stark contrast to the Crusaders in their heavy wool and worn leather. The atmosphere is thick with tension and a deep, unspoken mistrust. In these individual meetings, Alexios laid out his terms. He was polite, but his demand was non-negotiable. He required each leader to swear an oath of fealty to him. They would become his vassals for as long as they were on Byzantine soil. The most crucial part of this oath was the solemn promise to return to the Byzantine Empire any city or fortress they captured, which had previously belonged to it. In essence, they were to act as an imperial army of reconquest, not as independent conquerors. This, for the proud princes of the West, was a bitter pill to swallow. Godfrey of Bouillon, the pious duke, was one of the first to arrive, and he was deeply reluctant. He saw the oath as an affront to his honor and the holy nature of their mission. For a time he refused, and a 10th standoff ensued, with the emperor cutting off supplies to his army. But Godfrey was a pragmatist. He knew they could not proceed without Byzantine support. And so, for the good of the crusade, he knelt and gave his oath. The other northern French lords followed his lead. Then came Bohemond of Taranto. Alexios knew this man well. He was the son of Robert Guiscard, the emperor's old and hated enemy. Alexios expected a fierce, proud refusal. Instead, to his astonishment, Bohemond took the oath with surprising speed and apparent sincerity. But the emperor was not deceived. He saw the duplicity in the Norman's eyes. Bohemond was a master of the long game. An oath, to him, was merely a tool, a stepping stone to his true ambition, the creation of his own principality in the East. He and Alexios were two master strategists, circling each other, each fully aware of the other's cunning. The last of the great lords to arrive was Raymond of Toulouse. He was the oldest, wealthiest, and proudest of them all. He had come not for riches, but for salvation and he refused to become the vassal of any earthly king. He would not swear the oath of fealty. A dangerous impasse was reached, but Raymond, perhaps seeing a kindred spirit in the old and weary emperor, offered a compromise. He would not swear to be his man, but he would swear a different oath, an oath to respect the emperor's life and honor, and to see that no harm came to him or his possessions. Alexios, recognizing that this was the most he could get from the stubborn count, wisely accepted. In exchange for these oaths, Alexios was generous. He showered the leaders with gifts of gold, silk, and precious horses. More importantly, he opened his storehouses, providing their armies with vital food and supplies. He gave them Byzantine guides who knew the lands ahead, and even attached a contingent of Byzantine troops under a trusted general, but the relationship remained deeply fractured. A cultural chasm yawned between them. The Latins, in their direct and often brutal simplicity, saw the Greeks as effeminate, cowardly, and devious. The Greeks, with their ancient and sophisticated civilization, saw the Latins as uneducated, barbaric, greedy, and utterly untrustworthy. Once all the oaths were secured, Alexios moved with decisive speed. He did not want this massive, volatile army lingering by his capital for a moment longer than necessary. He used the Byzantine fleet to ferry them, contingent by contingent, across the deep, lapping waters of the Bosporus. As the ships pulled away from the European shore, the Crusaders would have taken one last look back at the glittering domes and towering walls of Constantinople. It was the last truly friendly city they would see for a very long time. They were now on hostile ground. The combined Crusader army had its first objective in sight: the formidable city of Nicaea, the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. Their war had finally begun. The city of Nicaea, known today as Iznik in modern Turkey, was a prize of immense strategic and symbolic importance. It was the capital of the Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan I, the same man whose forces had annihilated the People's Crusade less than a year before. The city was a formidable fortress. Its landward sides were protected by massive double walls, studded with over 100 towers, and its entire western edge lay upon the shore of the vast, deep blue lake Ascanius, which provided it with a secure route for supplies and reinforcements. It was here, in May of the year 1097, that the Crusaders began the first great military operation of their campaign. The various contingents, for the first time acting as a somewhat unified force, surrounded the city and began the grueling work of a medieval siege. The air soon filled with the relentless thud of catapults flinging heavy stones against the ancient walls. The Crusader camps became a sprawling city of their own, filled with the smell of dust, sweat, and blood. Great siege engines were constructed, including a massive wheeled tower, which was slowly pushed toward the ramparts. But the walls of Nicaea were strong, and the Turkish garrison fought back fiercely. Day after day, Crusader attacks were repulsed, and their frustration grew. Sultan Kilij Arslan, when he first heard of the Crusaders' arrival, was not overly concerned. He was away, fighting rival Turkish emirs in the east. He remembered the undisciplined rabble of the People's Crusade and assumed this new army was of the same quality. It was a grave underestimation. When he finally realized the true scale of the threat, he rushed back with his army and launched a furious assault on the besieging force. He was met not by a panicked mob, but by the disciplined shield walls and heavy cavalry of Raymond of Toulouse and Robert of Normandy. The battle raged all day, but in the end, the Sultan's forces were decisively repulsed. The Crusaders had proven their martial prowess, but Kilij Arslan, though defeated, was not broken. He retreated into the hills, ready to fight another day. Despite this victory, the siege dragged on. The Crusaders' main problem was the lake. The beautiful expanse of water, at first just a scenic backdrop to the siege, was now a critical strategic obstacle. Boats were slipping across it at night, keeping the city supplied with food and men. As long as the lake remained open, Nicaea could hold out indefinitely. The Crusaders, an army of land-bound warriors, had no navy and no solution. It was at this point that their uneasy alliance with the Byzantines proved its worth. Emperor Alexios, who was watching the siege from a nearby camp, devised a masterstroke of strategy. He arranged for a fleet of Byzantine ships to be brought from the coast. But he didn't sail them. In an incredible feat of logistics and engineering, he had them dragged overland on rollers and wagons, through the hills and forests, completely hidden from Turkish view. Then, one morning, under the cover of darkness, they were secretly rolled into the waters of Lake Ascanius. When the sun rose, the defenders of Nicaea looked out upon the lake and were met with a sight that must have seemed like a terrifying magic trick. The water, once their lifeline, was now filled with hostile Byzantine ships, cutting off their last hope of reinforcement or escape. For the Turkish garrison, the game was up. They knew what would happen if the city fell to the Latins by storm. They feared a general massacre. The Byzantine commander, however, offered them generous terms of surrender. Seeing the emperor's familiar standards flying from the ships, they chose the devil they knew. They secretly negotiated a surrender, not with the Crusaders who had bled for this siege, but directly with the emperor's representative. On the morning of June 19th, 1097, the Crusader army prepared for what they believed would be the final bloody assault. But as they looked towards the city, they were greeted with a shocking sight. The siege was over. Flying from the towers and walls of Nicaea were not the banners of Godfrey or Bohemond or Raymond, but the imperial standards of Emperor Alexios. Byzantine troops were in control of the city. The Crusaders had won, but they had been denied the climax of their victory. They were strictly forbidden from entering the city in force, and more importantly, they were denied their traditional right as soldiers, the right to plunder. For men who had sold everything they owned to come on this journey, the promise of loot was a powerful motivator. To have it snatched away at the last moment felt like a deep and bitter betrayal. The taste of disappointment was sharp, and their simmering mistrust of the Greeks deepened into a lasting resentment. Though they felt cheated of their prize, the capture of Nicaea was a massive strategic victory and a powerful morale boost. They had taken the Sultan's capital and proven they could defeat him in battle. Believing the Turks were now a beaten and scattered foe, the army made a fateful decision: to make the difficult task of finding food and water easier. They split into two columns as they began the long, arduous march into the heart of Anatolia. The confidence born from the victory at Nicaea would soon be shattered. The decision to split the army was a dangerous gamble, and it almost led to the complete destruction of the crusade. The host divided into two main groups, marching a day apart. The vanguard, the smaller of the two forces, was led by the Normans, Bohemond of Taranto and his nephew Tancred, along with Robert of Normandy and Stephen of Blois. The larger main force followed behind, commanded by Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and the papal legate, Adhemar of Le Puy. Kilij Arslan was far from beaten. He was enraged by the loss of his capital and his family, who had been captured and sent to Constantinople. He had united his forces with a rival Turkish tribe, gathering a truly massive army of swift and deadly horse archers. He knew the Crusaders were marching into his territory, and he watched them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When he saw them divide their forces, he knew his chance had come. On the 1st of July, 1097, near the ancient, ruined battlefield of Dorylaeum, Bohemon's vanguard made camp in a wide meadow. As the sun rose, they were not greeted by a peaceful morning, but by a terrifying sight. The plains around them were swarming with the enemy. Tens of thousands of Seljuk horse archers had appeared as if from nowhere, completely surrounding their camp. The attack was immediate and relentless. The Turkish tactic was a terrifying whirlwind of motion. They would not charge into the heavy European knights. Instead, they galloped in circles around the Crusader formation, firing a constant, deadly stream of arrows, a tactic designed to inflict maximum casualties while avoiding close-quarters combat. The Crusaders were caught completely by surprise. The air filled with a sound that one chronicler described as hissing like hail, the sound of thousands of arrows cutting through the air. Panic began to spread, especially among the terrified non-combatants. But Bohemond was a man born for battle. His voice rose above the chaos, and he gave a crucial order. He commanded his knights to dismount, to send their horses to the center of the camp, and to form a tight defensive circle. They created a wall of shields, a bristling ring of iron and courage, to protect the women, children, and priests huddled within. For hours, they endured this onslaught under the blazing, unforgiving Anatolian sun. The heat was immense. Men were fainting from thirst and heatstroke, their armor turning into ovens. The relentless rain of arrows found every gap in their shield wall. The ground became littered with the bodies of the fallen. Desperate, Bohemond sent messengers slipping through the Turkish lines, racing to find the main army and plead for help. As the hours dragged on, morale began to collapse. The defensive line wavered. The men were exhausted, thirsty, and losing hope. It seemed only a matter of time before they were completely overwhelmed. And then a shout went up. On the horizon, a cloud of dust. But this was not more of the enemy. Soon, banners became visible, brilliant in the sunlight. It was Godfrey. The main army had heard the sounds of battle and had marched with all possible speed. Godfrey and his knights did not hesitate. They formed up and charged directly into the Turkish flank, a thunderous wave of heavy cavalry that smashed into the unsuspecting Seljuks. The Turks, who had been focused entirely on the beleaguered vanguard, were thrown into confusion. A short while later, Raymond's contingent arrived from another direction, completing the encirclement of the tide of the battle turned in an instant. The Seljuks, who excelled at mobile, long-range warfare, were not prepared for a pitched, grinding battle against multiple fronts of heavily armored knights. Their fluid lines broke. Panic set in. The battle dissolved into a rout. The Turks fled, and the Crusaders pursued them, cutting them down as they ran. By the end of the day, the field belonged to the Crusaders. They had won a stunning, almost miraculous victory. They captured Kilij Arslan's personal treasury and all the riches of his camp. But more importantly, they had survived, and they had learned two vital lessons. First, they learned a profound respect for the speed and skill of their enemy. And second, they learned, in the most brutal way imaginable, that they must never, ever split their forces again. They had survived their first great test in open battle, but now the Crusaders faced a new, more relentless enemy, the land itself. Ahead of them lay hundreds of miles of arid, sun-scorched plains and mountains, a wasteland that would claim more lives than any battle. The march of thirst and starvation. The victory at Doryleum was bought at a high price, but the ordeal that followed would make that bloody battle seem like a fond memory. Between July and October of 1097, the Crusader army undertook a 3-month death march across the heart of Anatolia, an experience so horrific that it pushed them to the absolute limits of human endurance. Kilij Arslan, having failed to defeat them in open combat, now allowed the landscape to become his weapon. He initiated a scorched policy, sending riders ahead of the Crusader host to burn all the crops and poison all the wells. The Crusaders were marching into a deliberately engineered famine. The environment itself was a relentless foe. This was the Anatolian plateau in the height of summer. It was a brutally hot, arid, and alien world for which the knights and peasants of northern Europe were completely unprepared. The sun was a merciless hammer in a cloudless sky. The primary and most torturous enemy was thirst. Water was almost impossibly scarce. The wells they found were often fouled, the rivers dry. The feeling of a parched throat and cracked lips was a constant misery. Chroniclers of the Crusade write of people digging into the damp earth just to find a drop of moisture, of drinking the blood of their animals, or, in the final stages of desperation, their own urine. Food simply ran out. The foraging parties that rode out from the main column returned with nothing. The army was starving. The first to die were the animals, the great war horses of the knights, bred for the lush pastures of France and Germany, could not survive on the dry, sparse vegetation. Thousands of them perished, along with the oxen and mules that pulled the supply wagons. The route of the march became a grim pathway lined with the desiccated, fly-blown carcasses of their pack animals. This was a logistical and military catastrophe. It crippled their ability to carry supplies and dramatically reduced the number of their most effective soldiers. The mounted knights, many of the great lords and nobles, were reduced to riding donkeys or simply walking like the common infantry. With hunger and thirst came disease. The oppressive silence of the vast, empty landscape was broken only by the groans of the dying. The smell of sickness and death hung like a shroud over the exhausted, shuffling column of people. Dysentery and other illnesses swept through the weakened population, killing with silent efficiency. It is a sobering fact that more people died on this terrible march across Anatolia than in all the battles of the First Crusade combined. The non-combatants, the women, children, and pilgrims who followed the army suffered the most. They had no armor to protect them, no martial training to harden them. They simply lay down by the side of the track and died. Yet, even in this hellscape of despair, ambition survived. Two of the younger, more restless leaders, Baldwin of Boulogne and Tancred, saw little future in this slow march to starvation. Taking a small contingent of knights, they split from the main army and rode south into the lands of Cilicia, seeking their own fortune. It was a fateful decision that would eventually lead Baldwin to the city of Edessa, where he would establish the very first of the Crusader states. For the main army, there was no relief, only the grim determination to put one foot in front of the other. Their discipline and their faith were tested to the breaking point. But they did not break. They endured. Finally, in October, after 3 months of unimaginable suffering, they descended from the arid plateau. They saw before them green, fertile lands. They had crossed the wasteland, a skeletal, ragged, and utterly exhausted force. The remains of the great army that had left Constantinople stood at last before the towering walls of Antioch. They had reached the gateway to Syria, but their ordeal was far from over. The city was one of the most formidable fortresses in the world, and a long, bitter winter was coming. The march across Anatolia was an incredible feat of human endurance. Do you think you could have survived it? It's a humbling thought as we lie comfortably in our beds. Having endured the hell of the Anatolian desert, the skeletal remains of the great Crusader army finally stood before the towering walls of Antioch. They had reached the gateway to Syria, a land of ancient cities and biblical resonance. They were survivors of a trial by fire and thirst, hardened and tested. But their ordeal was far from over. The city before them was one of the most formidable fortresses in the known world, a sprawling metropolis protected by legendary defenses. And as the first chill winds of autumn began to blow, they knew that a long, bitter winter was coming. The siege of Antioch began in October of the year 1097. The city was a true giant. Its massive walls, originally built by the Roman Emperor Justinian, stretching for miles over hills and across valleys, punctuated by over 400 towers. The Crusader army, so depleted by the march across Anatolia, was a shadow of its former self. They did not have nearly enough men to completely surround the city, leaving several gates open through which supplies and messengers could still pass. The city's governor, a shrewd man named Yogi Sion, had prepared well for their arrival. He had stockpiled vast quantities of food and expelled most of the local Christian population whom he feared would betray him. The Crusaders, on the outside, were the ones who would go hungry. As autumn deepened into winter, their situation became desperate. A brutal, chilling rain began to fall, turning their sprawling camp into a miserable quagmire of cold, thick mud. The weather was a kind of suffering they had not yet known, a damp, pervasive cold that seeped into their bones. And with the cold came the hunger. It was a famine far worse than anything they had endured on the march. At first, they ate their remaining pack animals. Then, they ate their prized war horses. Soon, they were reduced to eating dogs, cats, and rats. As the weeks turned into months, they ate weeds, thistles, and boiled leather from their own shoes and shields. The camp, once alive with the sounds of a military force, fell into a grim, exhausted silence. The only smell was the smell of decay and desperation. The faces of the soldiers became gaunt and hollow-eyed, their bodies wasted by starvation. Day after day, they could only look up at the imposing, seemingly endless walls of Antioch, a constant, looming symbol of their failure. In this abyss of misery, morale shattered. Desertion, once unthinkable, became rampant. Men would slip away into the night, hoping to make their way back to Constantinople, or simply to die in peace. In a moment that showed how low their spirits had fallen, even Peter the hermit, the charismatic preacher who had started this whole movement, was caught trying to flee. He was dragged back before the princes and publicly shamed, a devastating blow to the army's sense of divine purpose. Later, another, even more significant leader would desert. Stephen of Blois, one of the wealthiest princes, convinced that the crusade was doomed, abandoned the siege and began his journey home. His decision would have fateful consequences. Yet, even in the depths of winter, their warrior spirit was not entirely extinguished. Twice, Muslim relief armies marched to save Antioch, one led by Dukak of Damascus, and a second by Ridwan of Aleppo. And twice the starving, freezing crusaders rode out from their wretched camp, and stunning displays of tactical brilliance and desperate courage smashed them completely. They were dying of hunger, but they could still fight like lions. As the siege dragged on, one man's cunning and ambition rose above the despair. Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman prince, with his unmatched military skill, became the army's key commander. But Bohemond was not fighting for God alone. He was fighting for He saw Antioch, a great and wealthy city, as the capital of a new kingdom, his kingdom, and he began to plot. He secretly made contact with a man inside the city, an Armenian captain of one of the towers named Firuz, who held a grudge against the governor, Yagision. Bohemond began to cultivate this connection, promising the man riches and power in exchange for his betrayal. Finally, as spring arrived, Bohemond made his move. He went before the other princes and declared that he, and he alone, had found a way into the city. But he would only reveal it on one condition, that once taken, Antioch would belong to him. This was a flagrant violation of the oath they had all sworn to Emperor Alexios. The other leaders, especially the pious Raymond of Toulouse, were outraged, but they were also at the end of their rope. 8 months of starvation and misery had broken their will. In their desperation, they reluctantly, bitterly, agreed to Bohemond's terms. Under the cover of darkness and howling wind, Bohemond led a small party of his best Norman knights to the base of the Tower of the Two Sisters. The tower, commanded by Firuz, a rope was lowered. With his heart in his throat, Bohemond was the first to begin the perilous climb. His men followed. Once inside, they crept along the walls, slitting the throats of the sleeping guards. They raced to a nearby postern gate, threw it open, and sounded a horn. The signal was given. The main Crusader army, which had been waiting in silent anticipation, surged forward. They poured into the sleeping city. After 8 months of suffering, their pent-up hunger, rage, and desperation exploded in a night of horrific slaughter. They had taken the city, but their triumph was short-lived. The Crusaders were now the besieged. A massive new Muslim army under Kerboga of Mosul was arriving, and the starving Christians were trapped inside a city they had just plundered, with no food left. The capture of Antioch should have been a moment of joyous triumph. Instead, it became the prelude to their darkest hour. Just 3 days after they had taken the city, the vanguard of a new, immense Muslim army arrived. It was led by Kerboga, the powerful Atabug of Mosul, who had assembled a grand coalition of emirs from across Syria and Mesopotamia. The Crusaders, who had just finished sacking the city, found that the governor had been hoarding his supplies well. There was very little food to be found. Almost immediately, they were starving again. But now, they were the ones trapped behind the walls. Kerboga's army surrounded the city, and the situation became utterly, completely hopeless. They had marched for years, survived a death march, and endured a horrific siege, only to die here, trapped in their prize. It was in this moment of absolute despair, when all seemed lost, that a strange and miraculous event occurred. There was a poor, insignificant peasant in the army, a pilgrim from Provence named Peter Bartholomew. He came forward to the leaders, his eyes wide with a combination of fear and conviction. The saint, he said, had revealed a secret to him. Buried beneath the floor of the great cathedral of St. Peter, inside Antioch itself, was the most sacred of relics, the Holy Lance, the very spear that a Roman soldier had used to pierce the side of Jesus Christ as he hung on the cross. The leaders were deeply skeptical. The papal legate, Bishop Adhemar of Lapoy, a wise and pragmatic man, dismissed it as the delusion of a starving mind. It was all too convenient. Their army was on the verge of collapse. They needed a miracle, and so, with heavy doubts, they gave Peter permission to dig. On June 14, 1098, a group of 12 men, including Peter Bartholomew and the chronicler Raymond of Aguilars, entered the cool, damp air of the ancient cathedral. All day they dug, turning the stone floor into a pit of earth and rubble. By evening, they had found nothing. He began to dig frantically with his hands. For a few minutes, there was silence, and then a cry from the pit. Peter Bartholomew emerged, his face ecstatic, holding aloft a sharpened, ancient-looking piece of iron. The effect on the common soldiers was immediate and electric. A collective gasp of awe was followed by a deafening roar of joyous belief. The skepticism of the leaders was swept away by a tidal wave of renewed faith. For the starving, desperate men of the Crusader army, this was a direct, unambiguous sign from God. He had not abandoned them. He was with them. They were his chosen army, and this was proof. Their morale, which had been at rock bottom, soared to ecstatic, fanatical heights. Filled with this newfound divine purpose, the leaders made a decision that, by any military logic, was pure insanity. They would not wait to starve. They would march out of the city and attack Kerboga's vastly superior army head-on. On the morning of June 28, 1098, the gates of Antioch swung open. The Crusader army marched out, not as a defeated rabble, but as a disciplined, confident force, arranged in battle formation. At their very head, held high for all to see, was the Holy Lance, carried by the priest Raymond of Aguilars, the sun glinting off its metal tip. Kerboga watched them emerge with arrogant disbelief. He was so confident in his numbers that he made a fatal mistake. He allowed the entire Crusader army to exit the city and form up on the plain before he attacked. He did not know that his own coalition of emirs was deeply disunited, many of them jealous of his power. As the Crusaders charged, their battle cry of "God wills it" on their lips, Kerboga's army began to fall apart. Some of his emirs simply deserted the field. In a stunning, almost unbelievable reversal, the small, starving Christian army, fired by a belief in miracles, completely shattered and routed Kerboga's massive host. With Antioch, now truly secured and left in the hands of the ambitious Bohemond, the path to Jerusalem was finally open. After a long delay due to internal squabbling, the remaining Crusaders, driven by the demands of the common soldiers, began the final leg of their long pilgrimage. The miraculous victory at Antioch had saved the crusade, but it had also fractured it. The army rested in the city for many months, recovering its strength, but the unity forged in desperation began to crumble. A terrible plague swept through the city in the wake of the battle, and it claimed the life of one of the Crusade's most important figures, Bishop Adhemar of Lapuy. The papal legate had been the spiritual heart of the expedition, the one man respected by all the princes, a constant voice of reason and compromise. His death was a devastating blow, and with him gone, the rivalries of the leaders festered without check. Bohemond made it clear he was going no further. He was now the Prince of Antioch, and he refused to give up his prize. This enraged Raymond of Toulouse, who saw Bohemond as an oath-breaker, and now his chief rival for leadership of the crusade. For months, the expedition stalled, paralyzed by the bickering of its commanders. But the pilgrimage had taken on a life of its own. the rank-and-file soldiers, the poor knights and peasants who had endured so much, had not come for principalities. They had come for Jerusalem. An atmosphere of near mutiny began to grow. They pressured Raymond, who styled himself as the new leader, to fulfill their sacred vow. Finally, in January of 1099, Raymond relented. He led the army out of Antioch, marching south. This new leg of the journey was startlingly different from what had come before. As they marched down the Mediterranean coast, the Crusaders were greeted by the sight of the deep blue sea, a welcome change after years spent in the harsh interior. The air was fresh with the smell of salt on the sea breeze. More importantly, the local Muslim rulers along the coast were now terrified of them. The news of their victories at Nicaea, Dorylaeum, and especially the unbelievable triumph at Antioch had spread. The emirs of the coastal cities chose not to fight. Instead, they offered the Crusaders supplies, tribute, and safe passage, asking only that they be left in peace. The feeling of being given food, instead of having to bleed and die for it, was a profound relief. But the journey was not without its troubles. The infighting continued. Raymond, in an act of prideful folly, laid siege to the minor city of Arca, wasting precious months on a pointless campaign and further frustrating the army. The controversy over the Holy Lance also resurfaced. Many, including followers of the now ascendant Godfrey of Bouillon, openly accused Peter Bartholomew of being a fraud. To prove the truth of his visions, the poor pilgrim underwent a terrible ordeal by fire. He walked through a blazing pyre and emerged alive, but he was so terribly burned that he died in agony days later. His death left the status of the relic shrouded in doubt and further poisoned the atmosphere in the camp. The army's patience finally broke. The main force, now looking to the more decisive leadership of Godfrey of Bouillon and the young fiery Tancred, simply bypassed Raymond and his pointless siege. Marching on toward Jerusalem, the pressure from the ordinary soldiers became unbearable. They had come too far to be stopped by the vanity of one old man. Humiliated, Raymond was forced to abandon the siege and rejoin the final push. The fractured but determined army pressed on, and then, on the morning of Tuesday, June 7th, 1099, they reached a hill. From its crest, they could see it. There, shimmering in the morning sun, were the walls and towers of a city that had been, until this moment, been little more than a dream. It was Jerusalem. For 3 years they had marched, fought, starved, and died, all for this single moment. The hardened warriors, men who had waded through blood and despair, fell to their knees. They wept, they kissed the sacred ground. The hill would forever after be known as Mount Hua, the Mount of Joy. They had made it. After 3 years of unimaginable hardship, they stood before the city that had lived in their imaginations and prayers. But the city was well defended, and the Crusaders were few. One final brutal effort was required. Their journey's end was in sight, but the final prize was a formidable challenge. The Jerusalem of 1099 was not held by the Seljuk Turks, but by the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, which had captured it only a year earlier. The Fatimid governor Eftekhar al-Dowla was a capable commander. He had a strong garrison of professional soldiers, and he had made shrewd preparations. He expelled the city's Christian inhabitants and, most critically, poisoned all the wells and cisterns in the surrounding countryside. When the Crusader army arrived, numbering only about 12,000 effective soldiers, they found themselves facing not only strong walls, but a familiar and terrible enemy. Thirst, The scorching heat of the Judean summer was relentless. With no clean local water source, supplies had to be laboriously hauled in skins from miles away. The suffering was intense. Fired by a desperate, feverish piety, they launched a direct assault on the walls on June 13th. But without siege engines, it was a hopeless endeavor. They were beaten back with heavy losses. Despair began to set in once more. They had come so far, only to die of thirst at the gates of the holy city. Their fortunes changed with an unexpected arrival. A squadron of Genoese ships, hearing of the Crusade's progress, had docked at the nearby port of Jaffa. They brought with them skilled engineers and, most precious of all, wood from their dismantled ships. Timber was incredibly scarce in the Judean hills, and this arrival was a godsend. Now, the Crusaders could build the weapons they needed. The camp was filled with the sounds of saws and hammers as two massive wheeled siege towers were constructed. One under the command of Raymond on the southern side of the city, and the other under Godfrey on the northern wall. As the physical preparations were underway, the Crusaders also prepared themselves spiritually. In a powerful display of unity and faith, the entire army, led by its priests, performed a barefoot procession. They marched in a solemn circuit around the city walls, fasting and singing hymns, before gathering on the Mount of Olives to listen to sermons. This act galvanized their morale, uniting them for the final, terrible task ahead. The final assault began on the night of July 13th. The fighting was ferocious. Raymond's tower was slowly rolled toward the southern wall, but it became bogged down in a ditch and faced fierce resistance. The main focus shifted north. Godfrey, in a brilliant tactical move, had his tower disassembled during the night and secretly reassembled at a different, less defended section of the wall. As the sun rose on July 15th, 1099, Godfrey's tower reached the ramparts. After hours of brutal fighting, 2 Flemish knights were the first to leap onto the walls, followed closely by Godfrey himself. They fought their way to a nearby gate and threw it open. The Crusader army poured into the city. What followed was a storm of religious ecstasy and appalling brutality. For 2 days, the Crusaders rampaged through the streets of Jerusalem. It was a horrific massacre. The chroniclers, who were there, describe it with a chilling mixture of piety and bloodlust. They wrote of streets running with so much blood that it came up to their horses' knees. The city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, who had taken refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque and in their main synagogue, were slaughtered without mercy. Men, women, and children were cut down in a frenzy of violence. The smell of blood and fire filled the holy city. When the slaughter was finally over, the Crusaders, their armor and swords still covered in the blood of the slain, made their way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site where they believed Christ had been crucified and resurrected. And there, in that most sacred of places, these men, who had just perpetrated an act of almost unimaginable savagery, fell to their knees and wept with tears of profound and overwhelming piety. It is a surreal and deeply disturbing image, one that captures the terrible, violent contradiction at the heart of their quest. Standing ankle-deep in blood in the holy places they had dreamed of for 3 years, the Crusaders had achieved their goal. Their impossible journey was over. The Holy Land was, in their eyes, reclaimed. The First Crusade was over. A thin strip of land on the far side of the sea was now in Christian hands, secured at an almost unimaginable cost. For the survivors, their pilgrimage was complete, but for the world, The consequences of their journey were only just beginning to unfold. The capture of Jerusalem was both a moment of profound religious fulfillment for the Crusaders and an act of appalling brutality. As you reflect on their journey, I hope you can rest with these complex thoughts. Thank you for listening. The impossible journey was over. After 3 years of blood, starvation, and unwavering faith, the city of Jerusalem was in Christian hands. The holy places, which had lived for so long as a distant dream in the minds of European knights, were now theirs. But as the echoes of the final, brutal assault faded, and the grim task of cleansing the city of its dead began, a new and profound reality set in. The crusade of conquest was finished. Now, the challenge of governance, of building a kingdom from the ashes of war, had to begin. In the week that followed the fall of Jerusalem, the city was a strange and somber place. The silence in its ancient, stone-paved streets was heavy. An echoing quiet left by the massacre and the absence of its former populace. For the Crusaders who remained, there was a feeling of awe, but also one of profound vulnerability. They were a tiny island of Latin Christians in a vast and hostile sea. The immediate and pressing question was one of leadership. Who would rule this new, fragile kingdom? The great princes of the Crusade gathered in council. The obvious choice, by virtue of his wealth, age, and seniority, was the powerful Raymond of Toulouse. He was formally offered the crown of Jerusalem, but in a move of either genuine piety or profound political miscalculation, Raymond refused. He declared that he would not wear a crown of gold in the city where his savior had worn a crown of thorns. Perhaps he expected the other lords to press him, to insist that he take the burden, but they did not. Instead, they turned to the other hero of the siege, the quiet and devout Duke of Lorraine, Godfrey of Bouillon. Godfrey accepted the leadership that Raymond had refused, but he shared the old count's pious scruples. He too refused the title of king. Instead, he chose a title of humble service, Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, the advocate or defender of the Holy Sepulchre. It was a title that perfectly suited his character, casting him not as a monarch, but as the chief guardian of Christendom's most sacred shrine. With a ruler chosen, one final military task remained. The Fatimids of Egypt, reeling from the loss of the city, had dispatched a large army to reclaim it. A month after Jerusalem's fall, the Crusaders marched out to meet them near the coastal city of Ashkelon. Though outnumbered, the Crusaders were filled with the confidence of victory and divine favor. They achieved a final, stunning triumph, scattering the Fatimid army and securing their new kingdom from immediate threat. And then a new kind of emptiness descended. For the vast majority of the knights and soldiers, their pilgrimage was complete. They had fulfilled their sacred vows. They had prayed at the Holy Sepulchre. Now, all they wanted was to go home. A great exodus began as thousands of Crusaders made their way to the coast to take ships back to Europe, their families, and their former lives. This left Godfrey, the new ruler of Jerusalem, with a desperately small force, perhaps only a few hundred knights and 1,000 infantry to defend his entire kingdom. The feeling of vulnerability was immense. A Frankish banner might now fly over an ancient desert castle, but its garrison was perilously small. This new Christian territory in the Levant came to be known by a romantic and evocative name, Outremer, the land beyond the sea. It was not a single, unified kingdom, but 4 distinct political entities, known collectively as the Crusader states. There was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the heartland and senior state. To the north was the Principality of Antioch, founded by the ambitious Bohemond. To the northeast, in the lands of Mesopotamia, was the county of Edessa, the very first of the states, which had been founded by Godfrey's own brother, Baldwin. And in time, the descendants of Raymond of Toulouse would carve out the fourth estate, the county of Tripoli, on the coast between Antioch and Jerusalem. These states were a unique creation. They were, in essence, a European feudal society, transplanted into the Middle East. They were a fragile network of fortified cities and imposing castles, ruled by a new Latin Catholic aristocracy. This small ruling class governed a diverse and far more numerous population of local Muslims, Jews, and a complex mosaic of Eastern Christian communities. Life for these new rulers was a process of adaptation. They learned to govern a multicultural society. They began to eat the local foods, dates, olives, and figs, becoming staples of their diet. They felt the warm, dry wind blowing over their newly conquered lands, and knew they were no longer in the green, damp fields of France or Lorraine. They were the lords of Outremer, dependent on a constant, tenuous trickle of men and money from Europe to survive. Their incredible journey had ended, and now their new life, as defenders of a kingdom born of faith and blood, had just begun. A kingdom had been born from the ashes of the Crusade. But what of the men who had forged it? Their fates would be as varied and dramatic as the journey itself. The great leaders of the First Crusade, the men whose ambition and piety had carved a new kingdom out of the East, did not all share in its future. Their lives after the glory of 1099 were a tapestry of pious rule, unending conflict, bitter irony, and often quiet, unceremonious ends. Their stories became the stuff of legend, a final chapter in the epic they had lived. Godfrey of Bouillon, the first ruler of Jerusalem, embodied the ideal of the perfect Christian knight. His rule, however, was destined to be short. For just 1 year, he governed as the advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, defending his fragile realm and establishing its laws. In the summer of the year 1100, he fell ill and died. His body was laid to rest in a solemn tomb within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre itself, the very shrine he had vowed to protect. In his death, he became more powerful than he had been in life, a legendary figure whose name would be spoken with reverence for centuries. His brother, Baldwin of Boulogne, was a very different man. While Godfrey was pious, Baldwin was pragmatic and ambitious. When news of Godfrey's death reached him in his county of Edessa, he did not hesitate. He marched to Jerusalem to claim the inheritance, and having no such scruples as his brother, he accepted the title of king. On Christmas Day in the year 1100, he was crowned Baldwin I, the first true king of Jerusalem, and he would prove to be a capable and energetic ruler who expanded the kingdom's borders. The fate of Bohemond of Taranto was more tragic. The brilliant and cunning Prince of Antioch saw his great ambition slowly curdle into failure. A few years after the Crusade, he was ambushed and captured by a local Turkish emir and spent 3 long years languishing in a dungeon. After being ransomed, he found his power in Antioch diminished. He traveled back to Europe, a celebrated hero, and raised a new army. But instead of returning to aid the Holy Land, he directed his new crusade against his old enemy, the Byzantine Empire. It was a dismal failure. He was defeated and humiliated by Emperor-elect. He sailed away from his principality for the last time and died in relative disgrace in Italy, his grand ambitions ultimately turning to dust. His nephew, the gallant Tancred, would rule in Antioch, becoming one of Outremer's most respected warriors. Raymond of Toulouse, the old count who had been denied the crown of Jerusalem, never returned to Europe. He remained stubbornly committed to carving out a domain for himself. He besieged and captured the great port city of Tripoli and began to establish a new county, but he died before his conquest was complete. His descendants would finish his work, ruling the county of Tripoli for generations. The stories of those who had deserted the crusade are particularly poignant. Stephen of Blois, who had fled the horrors of Antioch, returned home to his powerful wife, Adela, the daughter of William the Conqueror. She was so ashamed of his cowardice that she pressured him into returning to the Holy Land to fulfill his vow. He joined a later, smaller crusade, was captured in battle, and unceremoniously executed in 1102. Hugh of Vermandois, the brother of the French king, also returned home without completing his pilgrimage. Like Stephen, he was shamed into going back. He died from an arrow wound sustained in a minor battle, his vow fulfilled at the cost of his life. Perhaps the most ironic fate was that of Robert Curthos, Duke of Normandy. He returned to Europe, a celebrated hero, his reputation secured. But his glory was short-lived. He was soon embroiled in a civil war with his younger brother, King Henry I of England. He was defeated, captured, and would spend the final 28 years of his life as a prisoner in a series of castles. The hero of Jerusalem would grow old and die within the cold stone walls of a prison, a world away from the sun-scorched lands of his great adventure. The deeds of all these men were recorded by the careful quills of scribes, their lives and their often sad ends passing from memory into the quiet, permanent record of history. The lives of the Crusaders shaped the new kingdoms, but the world they had broken into was not a passive victim. We now turn our gaze to the other side of the hill to see how this invasion was perceived by the rulers and people of the Muslim world. While the new states of Outremer struggled to survive, the ripples of their creation were spreading outwards, profoundly transforming the Europe they had left behind. The thousands of crusaders who returned did not just bring back scars and stories. They brought back with them new ideas, new tastes, and new connections to a wider world, an influence that would gently reshape European society for centuries to come. The most immediate impact was on the institution that had launched the expedition. The stunning, improbable success of the First Crusade dramatically increased the power and prestige of the papacy. The Pope had shown that he could inspire and direct the martial energy of an entire continent, a feat no emperor or king could match. This victory emboldened the Church in its ongoing struggles for authority with the secular rulers of Europe. The feel of soft, luxurious silk from the East became a new symbol of status. The bustling marketplaces of Italy, filled with the exotic smells of Oriental goods, and the wealth they generated, fueled the coming Renaissance. The returning Crusaders were themselves agents of change. A knight who returned to his chilly stone castle in Normandy or Scotland was a man transformed. His skin was tanned and weathered by a sun his kin had never felt. He had seen cities larger and more magnificent than any in his homeland. He had encountered different cultures and ways of life. Around the fireplace on a cold winter's night, he would tell stories of Jerusalem, of Antioch, of strange customs and epic battles, opening the minds of his listeners to a world beyond their own small village. They brought back knowledge of Byzantine and Islamic medicine, of architecture and science. The intricate geometric patterns of Islamic art began to appear in the decorative motifs of European buildings. The Crusade also created new and powerful institutions. The constant, pressing need to defend the Holy Land and to protect the thousands of pilgrims now flocking their lead to the invention of a new kind of organization. The military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, were born orders of monks, who were also elite professional soldiers, a fusion of piety and martial prowess that would become a cornerstone of Outremer's defense and a major power in Europe. The very idea of crusading became a permanent fixture in the European imagination. To understand the success of the First Crusade, we must look at it from the other side of the hill. We must see it not as an epic of faith, but as a brutal and bewildering invasion. From the perspective of the Muslim rulers of the Near East, the arrival of the Franks was not a holy war, but a disaster born from their own internal weakness. The Islamic world of the late 11th century was not a unified, monolithic empire. It was deeply and bitterly fragmented. There were two great superpowers, each claiming leadership of the faith. In Persia and Iraq was the great Seljuk Empire, which was Sunni Muslim. In Egypt was the Fatimid Caliphate, which was Shia Muslim. These two powers were mortal enemies, engaged in a cold war for the soul of Islam. Syria and Palestine, the lands the Crusaders marched through, were a fractured battleground, a chaotic frontier zone contested by a host of minor impeding Seljuk emirs, who were often at war with one another, as well as with the Fatimids to the south. This disunity was the single most important factor in the Crusaders' success. They arrived at a moment of profound political instability. The great Seljuk Sultan, Malik Shah I, had died in 1092, and his death had plunged the empire into a series of destructive civil wars. When the Franks arrived, there was no single, powerful leader who could unite the Muslim world against them. Instead, the local emirs tried to deal with them individually. Some tried to fight, some tried to pay them off, and some even tried to use them as allies against their local Muslim rivals. They completely misinterpreted the nature of the threat. When the first reports arrived at the courts of Damascus or Aleppo of a strange new army of heavily armored warriors from the west, most rulers assumed they were just another wave of Byzantine mercenaries hired by the emperor in Constantinople. They had seen such soldiers before. They could not grasp the sheer scale of the expedition, nor could they comprehend its profound religious motivation. The idea of a mass migration of tens of thousands of people marching for years out of pure religious conviction was alien to their political and military experience. The chronic disunity of the emirs proved fatal time and again. The great coalition assembled by Kerboga at Antioch fell apart not because of the Franks' military genius, but because the emirs in his army were deeply suspicious of him and of each other. Many of them feared that if Kerboga won, he would use his newfound prestige to conquer their cities. They deserted him on the battlefield. The rulers of the Muslim Near East, in short, feared each other far more than they feared this strange new enemy. The news of the capture and subsequent massacre at Jerusalem was therefore a profound and horrifying shock to the entire Islamic world. The city was holy to them as well, the site of the Prophet Muhammad's mystical night journey. The loss of Al-Quds, the holy city, was a deep spiritual wound and a source of immense humiliation. In the quiet of a mosque in Damascus or a library in Baghdad, scholars and preachers tried to make sense of the catastrophe. How could this have happened? Early Muslim accounts refer to the invaders simply as Alifranj, the Franks. They saw them as barbarians from the dark, cold lands of the West, and they saw their success not as a sign of Frankish strength, but as a divine punishment for their own sins and, above all, for their own disunity. It would take decades for a unified response to begin, for a new generation of leaders to revive the military concept of jihad and begin the long, slow process of the counter-crusade. From their perspective, their world had been violently and inexplicably invaded, and the age of the Franks had begun. And so, our story comes to its final chapters. The great armies have dispersed, the kings have been crowned, and the echoes of their incredible journey have begun to settle into the dust of history. But the world they created, the kingdom of Outremer, was a fragile one, a place of constant, simmering danger. To survive, it would need to invent something entirely new, a new kind of man and a new kind of fortress. As our long tale now gently drifts towards its close, we can take a few moments to explore the fascinating whispers left behind by this new world, ideas and structures that would long outlive the kingdom that created them. In the newly conquered kingdom of Jerusalem, a fragile peace settled, but the roads remained fraught with peril. For the thousands of pilgrims who now began to flock from Europe to see the holy places for themselves, the journey from the coast to the holy city was a gauntlet of banditry and ambushes. The kingdom, with its tiny number of knights, could not hope to police every road and every mountain pass. A new solution was needed, one born from the unique blend of piety and violence that had defined the crusade itself. The first of these new solutions had roots that went back to before the crusade. For decades, a group of pious merchants from Italy had funded and run a hospital in Jerusalem, dedicated to caring for sick and weary pilgrims. They operated under the banner of St. John the Baptist. After the conquest, their work became more important than ever. Around the year 1113, the Pope officially recognized them as a religious order, the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, or simply the Hospitallers. Imagine the quiet, cool interior of their hospital ward. The air smells of medicinal herbs and clean linen. Here, brothers of the order, dressed in simple black mantles, would tend to the sick with a gentle and practiced care. Their mission was one of mercy. But in a land so dangerous, mercy alone was not enough. Soon, their role expanded. They began to provide armed escorts for the pilgrims they would later heal, their black robes covering coats of mail. A few years later, around the year 1119, a second order was born from a more explicitly military purpose. A French knight named Hugues de Payens and 8 of his companions were moved by the slaughter of pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. They presented themselves to the king, Baldwin II, and took a vow to dedicate their lives to protecting these dangerous routes. The king, with few men to spare, accepted their offer and gave them a headquarters in a wing of his own palace, a building that stood on the site of the ancient Temple of Solomon. From this location, they took their name, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ, and the Temple of Solomon, known to history as the Knights Templar. In their early years, there were only 9 of them, so poor that, as their famous seal would later depict, 2 knights had to share a single horse. They were a curiosity, a small band of pious warriors, but they soon found a powerful champion. Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman in Europe, saw in this tiny group the embodiment of a new Christian ideal. He wrote the rule for their order, a document that formally combined the rigorous, disciplined life of a monk with the bloody, violent profession of a soldier. A Templar knight would live in a monastery, but his prayers would be for victory. He would sing plain chant in his chapel, but his days would be spent on patrol, sword in hand. It was a radical idea, but one that perfectly suited the needs of this new world. Both the Templars, with their distinctive white mantles marked with a red cross, and the Hospitallers were given a remarkable privilege. They were made answerable only to the Pope. This gave them incredible independence from the control of local kings, lords, and bishops. Donations began to pour in from all across Europe, gifts of land, of castles, of vast sums of money from nobles who wanted to support the defense of the Holy Land. They established a network of commanderies, great estates all over Europe, which acted as recruitment centers and fundraising engines. From humble, pious beginnings, they grew to become 2 of the most powerful and wealthy organizations in the medieval world, the elite, professional, standing armies of Outremer. For a pilgrim taking their first nervous steps on the road from the coast, the sight of an escort of these warrior monks was a profound comfort, a feeling of safety made real. These new orders of warrior monks would not only defend the kingdom, they would build it. Their legacy is written in the stones of the great castles they constructed across the Holy Land. To travel through the landscape of the Holy Land today is to travel in the company of silent stone giants. On the crests of hills, guarding strategic mountain passes, and overlooking the blue Mediterranean, the castles of the Crusaders still stand. They are monuments of a forgotten power, their imposing beauty a testament to the genius and the desperation of the men who built them. They are perhaps the most tangible legacy of the world of Outremer. The kingdom was a long, thin strip of territory, constantly threatened by its far more numerous neighbors. The Crusaders were an occupying force, and they never had enough soldiers to control the land through sheer numbers. The castles were their solution. These great fortresses were force multipliers, allowing a very small garrison, perhaps only 50 or 60 knights, and a few hundred soldiers, to control a vast expanse of countryside and to hold out for months against an army of many thousands. The design of these castles was a masterpiece of military engineering, a fusion of the best ideas from different cultures. The Crusaders brought with them the traditions of the European stone keep, but they quickly learned from the more sophisticated designs of their Byzantine and Arab enemies. Early Crusader castles were often simple, rectangular towers, but over the decades they evolved into some of the most advanced fortifications in the world. The most famous and breathtaking of them all is the Crusade Chevaliers, a vast fortress in modern-day Syria that was held by the Knights Hospitaller. To see it is to understand the meaning of power. It appears to rise from the very rock of the mountain it sits upon, a sprawling city of stone. It is a perfect example of a concentric castle, a design the Crusaders perfected. Imagine two rings of walls. The outer wall is massive and imposing, but inside it is a second, even higher wall with taller towers. This ingenious design meant that archers on the inner wall could fire down upon an enemy who was attacking the outer wall, raining down a double shower of arrows. An attacker who managed to breach the first wall would find themselves trapped in a killing ground, exposed to fire from the towering defenses of the inner wall. As you walk through these silent ruins today, you can feel the strength of their design. You can run your hand over the cool, rough stone of a wall that has stood for 900 years. You can see how projecting towers allowed archers to fire along the length of a wall, a technique called enfilading fire, leaving no safe place for an attacker to stand. You would pass through a bent entrance, a series of sharp turns designed to break the momentum of a charge and expose attackers to fire from murder holes above. These castles were not just military bases. They were also the administrative centers of the great feudal lordships, and in times of war, they served as a refuge for the people of the surrounding villages. From the top of a keep, a knight could gaze out upon a panoramic view that stretched for miles, a visible symbol of his control over the land. The sound that fills these castles now is only the gentle whistling of the wind through empty arrow slits. But if you listen closely, in the deep shadows of the vaulted stone halls, you can almost hear the echo of footsteps in a now silent courtyard, a whisper of the life that once filled these incredible fortresses. These silent stones tell one part of the story, but to truly understand the people who lived this history, we must turn to the words they themselves left behind, preserved in the chronicles of their time. Our entire journey from the fields of Claremont to the streets of Jerusalem is only possible because a handful of people who lived through it took the time to write it down. In an age when most people were illiterate, a few weary priests and observant knights carried with them not just swords and crosses, but also ink and parchment. It is through their words, their biases, their faith, and their fears that we can hear the authentic voices of the First Crusade speaking to us across 9 centuries. Imagine a priest, perhaps a man like Fulcher of Chartres, sitting in his tent after a long day's march, by the flickering light of a single candle, with the sounds of the vast sleeping army all around him. He takes out his quill. You can almost hear the gentle scratching sound as he dips it in ink and begins to write on a heavy sheet of vellum, recording the events of the day, the miracles and the miseries. Fulcher's chronicle is one of our most precious sources, a detailed and intelligent account from a man who traveled with the army from the very beginning. Perhaps the most raw and immediate of all the chronicles is a text known as the Gesta Francorum, or the Deeds of the Franks. It was written by an anonymous Norman knight, a simple soldier who fought in the army of Bohemond. His Latin is unpolished, his prose is direct, but his account is filled with the visceral reality of the campaign. He tells us what the soldiers ate, how they fought, and how they felt. His is the unadorned voice of the warrior on the ground. This simple soldier's story was so powerful that several more educated writers back in Europe, men like Robert the Monk, would later take his text and rewrite it in a more elegant, literary style for a noble audience. Each of the major contingents had its voice. Raymond of Aguilors, the chaplain to the Count of Toulouse, gives us the perspective of the southern French, and as a fervent believer in the divinity of the Holy Lands, his chronicle is colored by a passionate, mystical faith. From the Byzantine side, we have the remarkable voice of Anna Komnene, the highly educated daughter of Emperor Alexios. From the quiet and scholarly safety of her rooms in the imperial palace, she composed a great history called the Alexiode. In it, she describes the Crusaders, whom she saw as uncouth and greedy barbarians, a dangerous force that her brilliant father had to carefully manage and manipulate. And we have glimpses from the other side, from the Arabic chroniclers like Ibn al-Kalenis of Damascus, who watched this invasion unfold with a mixture of confusion and horror. These sources are not objective. They are deeply personal and intensely biased. They disagree on the number of soldiers, on the motivations of the leaders, and on the meaning of events. And yet, it is this very quality that makes them so precious. Reading them is like listening to a conversation, an argument across time. They allow us, just for a moment, to see the world as they saw it, to understand what it felt like to believe a miracle had happened at Antioch, or to feel the profound shock of Jerusalem's fall. It is thanks to these fragile manuscripts, these whispers preserved in ink, that our story can be told at all. From the chronicles of the past to the memories of the present, the First Crusade has left an echo that has never truly faded. Its legacy is complex, controversial, and continues to shape our world in ways we may not even realize. And so, our long journey comes to its end. We have traveled across a world of faith and fury, of impossible endurance and unspeakable violence. We have seen how a single idea, spoken in a field in France, could move a continent and reshape the world. The echoes of that idea and the journey it inspired are with us still. The First Crusade holds a unique place in history. It was the first, and it was the only one of the major crusades to the Holy Land that truly succeeded in its primary objective. It captured Jerusalem and established a Christian kingdom that would last for nearly 200 years. In doing so, it set a precedent for centuries of conflict, creating a new and often violent relationship between the worlds of Western Christendom and Islam. The very idea of a crusade became a permanent, powerful, and often controversial tool in the hands of popes and kings. How this event is remembered has changed over time and depends greatly on where you stand. In 19th century Europe, the First Crusade was often romanticized, seen as a glorious adventure of chivalry, a tale of noble knights fighting for a pure and righteous cause. In the Middle East, the memory is very different. There, it is often remembered as the first chapter in a long and painful history of Western aggression and colonialism, a brutal invasion that left a deep and lasting scar. The memory of the sack of Jerusalem, in particular, remains a powerful and painful symbol. But if we listen quietly, beyond the politics and the polemics, we can hear more subtle echoes. The story of the First Crusade is a timeless testament to the incredible power of faith as a unifying and motivating force. It shows how shared belief can inspire ordinary people to achieve the seemingly impossible, to endure hardships that defy comprehension. At the same time, it stands as a dark and eternal cautionary tale of the horrors of religious intolerance. A reminder that the deepest faith can sometimes walk hand in hand with the most profound brutality. The world is different because of this single, distant event. The deep mistrust between the Eastern Orthodox Christianity of Byzantium and the Latin Catholic Christianity of the West was solidified into a permanent rift by the experience of the Crusade. The cultural and even genetic landscape of the Levant was forever altered by the long presence of the Franks. It was a pivotal moment of encounter, a time when two worlds, who were both fascinated and terrified by one another, collided with a force that would reshape them both. The story is not simple. It is a complex tapestry of motivations, a mixture of genuine piety and naked greed, of profound courage and shocking cruelty. And it is because of this complexity that historians continue to debate it, to study it, and to learn from it. Its story is a deep well of human experience. You can see its legacy in the face of a modern tourist walking through the silent stone halls of a Crusader castle, a quiet bridge across the centuries, and you can feel its echoes now in the stillness of this moment, in the sound of your own quiet breathing, in the comfortable weight of your blanket, in the gentle, peaceful darkness of your room. It is a feeling of letting go of the thoughts of the day, allowing the whispers of history to fade, to soften, and to dissolve into your dreams. And so, our journey ends. From a field in France to the walls of Jerusalem, we have walked with kings and peasants, witnessed miracles and massacres, and felt the weight of history on their shoulders. Their world is gone, but its whispers remain in the dust of the Holy Land and in the stories we tell. May their long, arduous journey help you find your own peaceful rest. Sleep well.